Have you got of Expo 88? Lutsy, like it was a defining moment in our history, and that's what this podcast is about.
World Expo 88 for me was a game changer as a young kid, as a 12-year-old in Brisbane. It's certainly every part of passion for the media I have comes from World Expo 88. I remember being absorbed by the Channel 10 or Channel X pavilion, which allowed you to watch the news live on a nightly basis, and I literally did that every single night. And then I think Triple M had a live radio studio at the top of the river stage as well. So I'd literally spend the other half of the night staring at some guy on the radio and thinking, my God, if one day I can maybe do this as a career. I didn't think it would ever be possible. But yeah, World Expo was a significant moment in my life and something I'll never forget.
And inspired both. Tell us the story of Matilda. Go on. What's the origin story?
Well, the origin story of Matilda, where she was birthed, was in a creative session in the ABC studios. And again, the statute of limitations luckily don't apply anymore. But there's a fair bit of red wine, and somewhere in there, the idea came up, let's have a kangaroo, with additions like the wink, but also the turning head. Well, the couch for the kiddies inside, where we had the joeys. Anyway, it all seemed possible, and indeed it was. We went to some props makers in Balmain, and they got a second-hand forklift because we had a budget of about $15,000, I think, for Matilda, and they built it for $15,000 on an old forklift truck.
So there was a forklift under it?
Yeah, that was the motivational force for Matilda. And so when we first got her on the track, Matilda, because of the age of the forklift, was a little incontinent and dropped oil. And hydraulic fluid on the beautiful running track. So there were people running after Matilda with nappies. And in fact, we did have to put a nappy on her for the show.
Oh, my goodness.
So along with the guys who were turning the head and doing the eyes, and they were chemically assisted on the day, I have to say. The kids down below, the little joeys in the pouch, they were fantastic. They bounced up and down on trampolines, and we all sang "Let's Call Australia Home" or something. And
it was a moment in time, and it was such a moment in time, wasn't it? Did you have any idea that it was going to be so iconic?
No, well, yes and no. I mean, we knew we were doing, a surprisingly good ceremony, as it turned out. But a journalist came up to me the day after the ceremony and said, "Geez, Rick, I had no idea we were going to so much trouble." And I said, "Well, you didn't go to much trouble, mate. You didn't come and see it." But afterwards, I mean, I realised, because driving to the stadium every day, there were a few signs and a few flags, but the day after there were flags everywhere, all over Brisbane. There were Australian flags as a result, I guess, of the ceremony.
Waiting to get involved.
She's over there doing the chicken dance.
I'm breaking protocol here because I know we were going to bring her in, but I feel like we have to. Sallyanne Atkinson, ladies and gentlemen, the Lord Mayor of Brisbane from 1985 to 1991. She's been president of chair of various organisations and boards over the years. This is an interesting one. Recipient of the Australian Catholic University's highest honour, a doctor of the university, recognising Sallyanne's extraordinary contribution to Australia's international reputation as a location for sporting events, and of course the contribution of government and community as well. And I guess significantly in the context of this podcast, a key figure in the Brisbane 1992 Olympic bid, which was unfortunately unsuccessful, and the successful Sydney 2000 bid, where she would go on to be the Deputy Mayor of the Olympic Village as well. How's that for a LinkedIn profile?
That's certainly better than yours, Lutsy.
That's just the tip of the iceberg as well, with Sallyanne Atkinson, a very welcome so very heartedly to our podcast.
And we were lined up to go to Berlin to say, here we are, we're ready, to the IOC in May.
Yes.
So it was a very quick sort of learning process. And that's when I called Kevin Gosper in Melbourne, who is the president of the Australian Olympic, and said, help, Kevin. Look, I just need a bit of advice on this. And that's how John Coates came to come to Brisbane.
A young John Coates.
Young John Coates.
So how did that happen? Who was he at that point?
Well, he was a suburban solicitor, I think, in Sydney. He was a solicitor in Sydney, very involved in sport, very involved in sport administration. He had been a rower. His wife was a rower. But I didn't know him, and nobody had heard of him. But Kevin Gosper did know him and suggested that John would be the man. And John turned out to be the man, and he moved all his family, wife and 5 kids. He had one in Brisbane. His only daughter was born in Brisbane, his Brisbane child. But he came up to Brisbane in, I suppose, about June of that year, stayed here for, well, I think, just trying to think, I have to do the maths on when we actually went, but a long time.
So what was your role with him? How did you, become friends, or what was it like?
No, we became great friends. Yeah. I was the chairman of the Olympic bid,
yes.
And he was the CEO. So it was a chairman CEO. I mean, he and his family had Christmas Day with my family out at Indooroopilly. So it was that close a relationship.
Did he call that the girl? Did he call her Matilda or Sallyanne? Which choice did he go with?
Good point, actually. What was his daughter's name? It could have been Sallyanne.
Neither Sallyanne nor Matilda.
So talk us through what happened when he got to Berlin, and here's Sallyanne. 1 month into being Lord Mayor, and little Brisbane on the world stage saying, hey, wouldn't mind having the Olympics. We held a successful Commonwealth Games a couple of years ago. Talk us through how that played out. What was the vibe when you got there?
I suppose the first vibe was one of surprise. First of all, people say everybody in Europe, most people in the world had heard of Sydney and Melbourne if they thought about Australia. Yeah. If they thought about Australia at all. They didn't really know about Brisbane. The Commonwealth countries might have for the Commonwealth Games. And this was pre-Expo when the world really did get to know Brisbane. So it was a surprise. And the other surprise was me, a female Lord Mayor.
Still the only Lord Mayor in Brisbane's history.
Only female Lord Mayor, ridiculous. And I spoke French. And I was young. So all those things went right against the stereotype of Aussie blokes sporting. I mean, I am the most non-sporting person in the world. Surprisingly, I have been to 5 Olympics. Yeah. So I'm very big in knowledge of the Olympics, but as a spectator, which is probably a very good way to do it.
Do you think that was a positive? Do you think the fact that you thought you stood outside from that hardcore sporting sphere and thought more about the event space of it and the way it affected the people might have been one of your strong points in the end?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I was a curiosity. I mean, I don't walk away. I'm honest. I don't walk away from that fact that it wasn't that I was overly impressive, but I was different.
And it was the 80s, so how impressive were the shoulder pads that you had on in the
the
power
shoulder
suits?
pads were great. They were good. And I took the robes with me. Can't believe it now.
Did you really?
I don't think Adrian took the robes when he went to Tokyo.
Dog didn't take him to Tokyo.
I took the robes and I was clanking my chains, and when Rupert Murdoch had this sort of wonderful lunch in East Berlin, which we weren't allowed to call East Berlin. That was a drama about that. Yeah. But I wore the robes and the chains and spoke in French. It was the speaking in French that they really
And
liked.
how do you sort of get through a lobster while you're wearing the robes? That would be a remarkable challenge.
No, I think I cut it up into little bits. So they were, I mean, as you say, Chris, it was the 80s. So the flowers were flown in from Melbourne. Yeah. Some very swanky florist, whose name I can't remember, and a very swanky caterer. All the food, all the flowers, everything came from Melbourne, and we had a bit of a problem with the seafood that was going to be held up by customs or immigrations at the border, but diplomatically we managed to get that through.
It was like you look at the history of the games, etc., and cost blowouts and etc., and there was a different era. There's the new normal now at the Olympics about trying to be cost effective and almost cost neutral with the Olympics. But when you look back at the bid processes, it wasn't a great deal of difference. You were using primarily existing infrastructure for that 92 bid, the same way that in 2032 the basis of the Brisbane bid was existing infrastructure. The Boondall cluster was going to be a huge thing. I lived at Boondall at that time. Like, you were going to turn the swamplands of Boondall into a games village. It
was going to be the Olympic village.
Yeah, right.
Very good.
We were very proud of Boondall as going to become front and centre, but it was using the 82 facilities mostly. I mean, ANZ, QE2 was going to become a 100,000 seat new stadium, the same way that the Gabba is for 2032. There were similarities.
And that's the very good one of the many good things about hosting the Olympics. It's an incentive to get things done, things built. And Sydney had very poor infrastructure before the 2000 Games, but on the back of having the Games, they managed to get those things. So the bid was very different in many ways. First of all, it was low cost. It was about 5 or 6 million. We had money left over, which we initiated a sports scholarship, for which Kieran Perkins was the first winner of that after the Games. And when you think of what it costs cities now to bid, it's quite extraordinary.
Yes.
But they were simpler times. We were allowed...
Before we sort of look forward to 2032, you mentioned before, you said the word LA 1984, where you produced and directed the opening and closing ceremonies, or you're director of production.
You going Jetman?
These were, yes, I'm going to Jetman. So this was a major moment in time, turning point for, how you do big events and theatrical big events and so on. But still, what strikes me is Rocket Man. Can you just quickly tell us the story?
Yeah, well, Rocket Man, in fact, existed and had existed for some time. There's a guy named Kenny Gibson, and he'd bought a rocket belt from Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which had developed it for the American military.
Right, okay.
The American military had said, we need to get away, get over minefields, get over walls, get over whatever. So JPL had come up with this rocket belt at huge expense, I mean, millions of dollars, to lift a soldier. So the soldiers strapped it on, and they had, in the end, because you can only burn as much fuel as you can carry, and so they could carry enough for 12 seconds of ignition. So they had 12 seconds of lift.
Oh, my God.
And anyway, so the American military worked out, not only did they only have 12 seconds of lift, if they carried anything like a gun or a hand grenade or ammunition...
So 11 seconds. less time. We get the math. That's not good.
So they ended up with guys standing on the ground, heavily laden and going nowhere, but with big flames coming out the back. Anyway, so Kenny Gibson bought 2 belts from JPL, the only 2 in existence at the time, and he had flown at different things, and so we'd seen him at a hot rod kind of show where he's paid $25 to come over the hill or something. Anyway, we said about the Olympics, so Kenny was very excited, and he said, I reckon I could get over the peristyle, which was the building at the end of the stadium. I reckon I could get up and over that, and then I'll have 5 seconds left.
Keep in mind, if he doesn't get over that, he plows straight into the audience. Like, as a director, to be involved, that must have, I mean, as an element, this could be the most exciting thing ever, or this could be literally you just walking out the back and never being seen again.
Well, we did rehearse it, and Kenny promised that he would go down the audience aisle. So, if he flamed out,
makes sense.
And actually, I said,
would just be singed.
Well, I said, don't come too low because there'll be ladies in polyester down there.
Oh my God!
But in fact, those early belts used the same fuel that sends rockets up. It's liquid hydrogen peroxide.
Yeah, right. So
what's hugely inflammatory and explosive?
What do they use now? Like the Brisbane Heat did it.
No, they're using. I don't know. It's a kerosene-based aviation fuel or something. It's not this.
Not rocket fuel, literally.
But we used the real thing because that was what worked the belt.
Lucky there's no open flames at an opening ceremony, so it's nice and safe to have plenty of fuel lying around.
Good point. No one's making cigarettes these days.
We had a tanker of hydrogen peroxide out the back, surrounded by security. There was a fair bit of nervousness, but anyway, Kenny got up in the air, and I mean, he flew the mission,
landed on the little circle thing, and
no problem. And an Italian company called him up straight away and offered him $5 million to come and do it in Italy. He couldn't believe it. Off he went to Italy the next day.
And but the main thing, as a kid in '84, thinking, oh my God, imagine us in 30 years, we'll all be doing that. We're not doing that. What happened there?
Let's sort of think about. So, if this bid would have been successful, we would have had the idea was 4 zones. So you had the central zone, which would have been things like boxing at Festival Hall, tennis at Milton, water polo at the Valley Pool. Then you would have had the Chandler zone, where Kieran Perkins, if we go to 92, would have won his first gold medal and set a world record in front of a home crowd.
Chandler.
Then you got Chandler, which was QE2 was going to be 95,000 capacity. So building that up. Probably roll out Matilda again, I would imagine. And then out at Boondall, which we've spoken about, you would have had the basketball, beyond the athletes village, basketball, there would have been the dream team. out there for their debut in the
92.
Olympics. She wouldn't have dreamed him of Love Boondall.
Was it Sue's Corner or the Pizza Plaza? Where would they have eaten? I mean, you got the Golden Bamboo Chinese. There's a lot of great restaurants in Boondall.
Lining up to get in the train at 10:30.
I was going to say, how would they have got out of the car park, which is a major exercise. But
it would have changed. It would have changed a whole heap of things. What would South Bank have become? Because after World Expo in '88, it would have become the ICE, the International Broadcast Centre at South Bank for the '92 Olympics. So that would have created an existing.
Well, that would mean...
South Bank have existed today?
I was going to say that would mean that South Bank, as we know it, would not be there. And to me, South Bank is so much the jewel in the crown of Brisbane at the moment. I mean, there cannot be any other city in the world that has that amount of land on the banks of the river and within walking distance of the CBD.
I went to Seville in 1999, 7 years after they had World Expo. Mm-hmm. And the Seville site was in a very similar position on the river, on the banks of the river, but 2.5 times as big as South Bank. And it was... grass higher than my head, dilapidated buildings. It was a wasteland, an absolute wasteland 7 years after World Expo 92 in Seville.
Is all about planning and management. And if anybody asks me about 2032, we've got to get the planning and the management right now. I went to Expo in Vancouver in '86 on the way to the Commonwealth Games, as you would, looking at all the bidding there. And when I talked to people, '86, the Expo was happening, and they were in a bit of a panic in Vancouver because they hadn't done anything properly for what was going to happen afterwards. So when I came back in '86, I said, no, we've got to start now. And the man who had actually got the sort of the gig, if you like, to do the planning for Expo in post-Expo in Vancouver, we got him out. We got all the developers, all the people in town together, big meeting in City Hall, saying, let's do this thing properly. And I do believe that that's why it has worked so well for us, because it's no use just having an event. You've really got to think
build
after
legacy, right?
And interestingly, the IOC now is very concerned about the legacy of the games.
Yes.
They want
I'm just thinking of some of the others. You were involved in Barcelona?
The Archer in Barcelona.
Did it need to go over it, or was it just flicking a switch?
No, what it was, it started off when we did the pitch, we had a fabulous illustration of a Greek athlete. It was splendid, looked like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and naked with a bow and arrow. And Juan Antonio Samaranch, who was the head of the IOC, but was also Spanish and from Barcelona, so he paid a lot of attention to it. So we pitched this and showed him the thing, and he didn't blink at the nakedness. He just said, do you think you can find someone who looks like this?
On the Spanish archery team.
And in fact, the guy who did it was on the Spanish Paralympic team.
Oh, really?
Because he had a slightly withered leg from polio. Yeah. But he could pick the music. And the whole thing with the music, which was written for the whole arrow thing, there's a moment where he draws the bow back and the music goes dun, 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 dun. And then there's a release moment, and then the music build, and then it goes whoomp as the flame takes off. And the music was scored specifically to match Antonio Rebollo, his name was, to match his actions. And we had a standby archer who wasn't nearly as good. He couldn't count beats, and he'd released the arrow at the wrong time. So we were really hoping that Antonio was going to hold up on the day, and he did.
And he did. Now, did it light it, or was it?
It did light it. Well, the thing was, we couldn't fire the arrow into the cauldron because it's full of gas line, very fine thing. So if an arrow had gone into that, we would have had an explosion. So it had to go
through and then
went through a cloud of gas. We also, of course, had an igniter on standby.
Where did it land, the arrow?
It landed. We fired 800 arrows in tests, and they all landed within a few metres of each other on the road outside.
Right,
which
so
was
you cleared a space.
Cordoned off by the cops, yep.
That's a great story.
So, for example, before Expo, most people of the age I am now, who were my parents back then, in Brisbane we'd have tea at 5 o'clock, and then we'd listen to the radio perhaps, and then we'd go to bed. We didn't eat out at night. You couldn't get a meal. You couldn't get a drink in Brisbane at night.
Nope.
After Expo, all that changed. People got used to the idea of, wow, we've got this great climate. And back then, the health regulations said that if we had eating on the footpath or eating out of doors, the flies would carry us off and the dust would choke us.
And Sallyanne, to this day, that still shocks me, if it not shocks me, in a nice way, I think, when someone says, we're changing this precinct so we can get meals at 11. I still go, what? We can do that in Brisbane? I think to this day, that's still a thing that's very much changing. We're still coming to grips as Brisbane people that we are becoming, hopefully, a cosmopolitan city that can perform on an international level.
And because all those people from all over the world came to Brisbane and said, wow, look what you've got here. We went, oh, because we were so used to the Great Southern Put Down up till then.
Yeah.
Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne would go, oh, Brisbane, oh.
Yeah,
yes.
easy
Which
target.
then leads to, the slogan for the bid, which was Brisbane's ready.
And
We'd come out of ourselves and actually started believing in ourselves.
We had this call from a journalist by the name of Wayne Smith, and he put it to me, would Brisbane be interested in bidding for an Olympic Games? And I said to him, no, we wouldn't. But as a region, we probably would. And we'd look at a Brisbane region bid. So therein lied the trick. So we had a discussion on the 6th of March 2015 as a group of mayors, and we resolved unanimously to look at furthering the opportunity for an Olympic bid. And at that point, we then wrote to the Prime Minister, who was Tony Abbott at the time, Anastasia Palaszczuk as Premier, and we wrote to John Coates. And the letter we got back from John Coates was, to support it, but more importantly, what he did was he put us, or established for us, a telephone hookup meeting with Thomas Bach, the international president, within a month. Now that could have been a real showstopper.
Okay, so that you needed the IOC on board, at least acknowledging the fact that you were interested at that point.
Well, there was that, but there was also this other conversation that needed to be had, because as a group of mayors, we said we're not prepared to do this at any cost. There's going to have to be some conditions, and we could have been dead meat in that first half-hour phone conversation. It was actually in Sydney. Mayor Mark Jamieson from the Sunshine Coast went to Sydney. I couldn't go for family reasons at the time, but I was on the telephone and led the discussion on the phone. There were three things we put to him. The first thing was, I said, Mr. President, this is unusual. Usually cities do the bids. We want to do it as a region.
Yep.
And he was just silent, and I could sense that there was a bit of uneasiness about this. But then we set about explaining how this would work and the travel times that would be involved, and how we could make it happen as a region. When we wanted to do this because we wanted to get the collective benefit of it as well. And so the second thing then, he said, well, leave that with me. The second thing was we're really concerned about bid costs. 60 million for a bid cost. And then often you'd have to bid a second time before you'd get it.
Yeah.
So we thought, well, that's a bit much. And the third thing was, and this was the big one for us, was building white elephants. And I said, just as respectfully as I could, but I said, there are a litany of white elephants around the world where Olympic Games facilities have been built and never used again.
Google it on YouTube.
Absolutely.
There's literally tens and tens of them that are just old, washed up, derelict buildings now, almost suburbs.
Exactly, Lutzi. And, they were almost from every Olympic Games. We had these leftover facilities. And so, I said to him, I just sense, Mr. President, that, it's going to get harder to get cities to put their hands up because of the public reaction to white elephants being left behind from Olympic Games and Paralympic Games. And so, anyway, as I say, we could have been out.
They're three brave things to put to the president of the IOC at that point. It's turned out to be that's the way it now operates.
The new normal.
If you rewind to that point, it was still. Yeah. It's a very bold meeting. Was that intentional to just go in there and just lead with your chin?
Yes, it was, because it came down to the point that we were not prepared to do this at any cost. There had to be a demonstrative advantage to southeast Queensland and to the nation through all the things that it would bring for us to do this. And so it wasn't at all cost situation.
You could almost put an argument forth.
My main concern is that things move. Things have got to move. You're talking about numbers of days. They will go in a flash.
Yep.
And one of the great issues, I think, is making sure that decisions are made early, timelines are put in place. We all know there is labour shortages in this country in terms of building things, and it's not going to be able to be built in the last few years. There's got to be a pipeline put in place, and that's going to mean...
it would too, yeah. And of course then Natalie Cook, who was the 2000 gold medalist. So we've got Cook, Johnson, Miles and Palaszczuk. Graham Quirk, your thoughts on those four the state four, if you like, in the on the Bocog board?
Well, I mean, you've got two athletes. Whether you needed two pollies is probably a question for debate. Whether you need any, in fact, is really a question for debate in a sense.
Yeah.
I think, though, obviously, of those four, Natalie Cook brings the energy, the enthusiasm, the absolute experience, not only of being an athlete, but she's been so intricately involved in the Olympic movement over that time since she was a gold medalist. And she'll just bring a wealth of experience to the table.
Okay, so your point there is that politicians, are they overriding these committees?
Oh, look, I haven't been involved in the last 2 years. When I left public life, and I've tended not to engage in debate around what they do. I mean, they'll have their reasons for it. I guess they want to maintain some control. It also gives additional profile from a practical political point of view. There are things why you'd put yourself on there, I guess. But from an Olympic body point of view, my main concern is that things move. Things have got to move. You're talking about numbers of days. They will go in a flash.
Yep.
And one of the great issues, I think, is making sure that decisions are made early, timelines are put in place. We all know there is labour shortages in this country in terms of building things, and it's not going to be able to be built in the last few years. There's got to be a pipeline put in place, and that's going to mean quick, early decisions and get on with it.
Okay.
That's my bit. I'm leaving it at that.
Calm my nerves,
yeah.
Lord Mayor.
Like any sense that we're kind of off track feels like that we're on track. How did you feel coming out of that meeting? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Oh, look, I feel the same way. It's it's one of those things where you need a leader that brings confidence to the role, that he's on top of it. He's got a clear vision and also can deal with all of the different stakeholders and challenges. And so, Andrew is that guy. He's definitely that guy, and had major international experience. Has had to deal with different US presidents from different parties, wildly different personalities there, and managed to navigate through that. So, if you can deal with, one day you can deal with President Obama and the next day you can deal with President Trump, I think you can deal with almost anything. So it's
science and technology graduates at the University of Queensland and QUT and Griffith University saying, okay, let's spend the next 9 years or next 6 or 7 years developing LEDs, which are more cost effective and can light our stadiums and put on a magnificent show that will match or surpass what we see in Los Angeles, the city of angels, in 2028.
I can see why you're my deputy.
So you have to look beyond those events.
I still think I've got this whole theory, Sallyanne. I want to see if you run with it, you too, Christopher. I think the Expo and the Olympics are more intrinsically linked than we think it should be. And I'll tell you why, because I, just before COVID, went to San Francisco and I realised the history that I think San Francisco back in the day, like 1920s, had World Expo. And what it was all the great minds of the world on ships would come and meet, and they basically go, what have you invented? Well, I've invented this, and Newton would say this, and blah, blah, blah. And it became a centerpiece of a showcase of technology and innovation. And I think that there's a link at the Olympics that we've missed, where the International Broadcast Centre and the Games Village out on North Shore at Hamilton should be a showcase of an expo-style showcase of what we are capable of in technology and things like that, where at the moment the Olympic Village traditionally at the Olympics has been a massive cafeteria and a cardboard bed.
And condoms.
And condoms.
Yes, bowls full of condoms.
We just found the name of this podcast, by the way. The second episode is called Bowls Full of Condoms. Featuring Sallyanne Atkinson.
Mother of...
He says an accident.
Here's the 80s. Here's the Brisbane 80s inspired idea.
Go on.
They all get to the Gabba. The Gabba looks amazing.
Yes.
Sallyanne Atkinson, matriarch of the game, sitting there on her throne, front and centre, spotlight on, all that sort of stuff.
Wearing a good hat.
Big hat.
So we get the crowd involved early on with the chicken dance, stealing the idea from Expo 88.
World Expo, the German beer hall from World Expo.
Full chicken dance experience. And then we hand out the first gold medal of the games. The first gold medal is decided during the opening ceremony.
Yes.
And as a nod to Billy J. Smith, it's a knockout. We run an It's a Knockout competition. With every country needs to put up their 6.
Where's Jackie McDonald these days? Was Jackie McDonald and co-hosted with Billy Joe?
Well, Jackie's down at Eat Street every Friday night.
This is coming together already.
It's in the shadows of the village. That's perfect. Yes.
But they need to wear the velour sort of, full colour tracksuits. Yep. And then off we go with the game. It's a knockout. And then hand out the first gold medal. And then the Olympics, the moment that we're all waiting for is the torch is lit.
Yes.
Kim Durant on the top of the Gabba sings Love You Brisbane.
Yes, was that the original? Kim Durant was the...
Kim Durant, yes. Love You Brisbane. As Agro lights the flame. What do you think?
The problem with that is Agro could actually light him. Unfortunately, it could become a...
All right, I'll cross Agro.
That could go viral on TikTok, unfortunately, if we accidentally light Agro whilst lighting the torch.
But perhaps by then, you see, technology, there'll be some new material for Agro.
Fire-retardant Agro. If there's one thing we do in the next 11 years, it's develop a material that allows Agro to light the Olympic flame.
Well, there you go. There's a legacy for you.
If they ain't allowed it is to look back and feel all historic and nostalgic, I think that the great thing is that Expo created and then the movements across Brisbane through time is that guys like Chris and I who met at the Olympic torch relay in 2000.
Oh, truly?
That's where we met, and here we are 21 years later still working together with a forward passion. With you in the room is, I think, a pretty special, pretty cool thing.
And which reminds us it's all about people.